The reveal trailer for Battlefield 5, released in May 2018, was supposed to get fans excited for the franchise's return to World War II. Coming off the back of Battlefield 1, which had successfully captured the bleak tone and emotional gravity of World War I, while still being fun to play. Expectations were sky high. Players were hoping for something similar, a serious, large-scale and immersive look at the most iconic conflict in modern history. Instead, what they got was a trailer that left many viewers scratching their heads. From the very first moments, the trailer felt strange. It was fast-paced, chaotic and packed with dramatic camera angles, explosions and action set pieces. But that in itself wasn't necessarily a problem. Battlefield has always leaned into cinematic spectacle, but the tone fell off. Instead of gritty realism or even stylized intensity, the trailer gave off the vibe of a war-themed action film directed by Michael Bay. The visuals were loud and overly saturated, and the sequence itself looked like it just didn't fit World War II theme. Characters were sliding across the ground, jumping out of windows, firing from the hip while flipping through the air. For many viewers, it felt jarring, but the most talked about moment, the one that truly sparked the firestorm, excuse the pun, was the inclusion of a British female soldier with a mechanical prosthetic arm, wielding a fucking cricket bat and also having war paint on her face.
What the fuck was that?
She was prominently featured, even on early box art and promotional materials. The character design was undeniably bold and meant to stand out, but for a game set in one of the most documented and deadly wars in history, it felt wildly out of place to many fans. Now, to be clear, the presence of women in World War II combat roles isn't historically inaccurate in and of itself. Women served in the Soviet Red Army, in partisan groups across Europe, in resistance movements and in a variety of non-combat but still dangerous roles like medics, spies and pilots. There are incredible real-life stories of women who fought bravely and contribute to the war effort in ways that would absolutely deserve representation in a video game. But here's the problem. DICE didn't communicate that context. Instead of anchoring the female protagonist in a real, historically grounded story or role, the trailer presented her in a hyper-stylized action hero way that didn't align with the tone fans were expecting. It didn't feel like an effort to honour the real women of World War II. The character's mechanical arm, exaggerated mannerisms, and flamboyant design led people to believe this wasn't about authenticity or respect. It was about style over substance, and just ticking off some DEI boxes. Worse, the trailer didn't balance this with anything that felt like a classic Battlefield. There were no iconic World War II settings, no storming the beaches of Normandy, no desperate defence of Stalingrad, no dogfights over London or Midway. The map shown in the trailer was vague and unfamiliar, giving no clear indication of what kind of campaign or multiplayer experience players should expect. Many fans were left wondering, is this really supposed to be a World War II game? The inclusion of outlandish customization only added to the confusion. Later marketing materials showed soldiers with blue face paint, bright clothing, golden prosthetic limbs, and other bizarre cosmetics. It started to feel like Battlefield 5 wasn't even trying to be about World War II. It was using the setting as a loose backdrop while focusing on cosmetics and personalisation that just didn't fit that time period at all. For fans who loved the previous game for their mix of authenticity and scale, especially coming off the back of Battlefield 1, this reveal was a shock. Instead of building hype, it caused doubt and skepticism. People weren't sure what the game was trying to be. Was it a historical shooter, an alternate history fantasy, or a war-themed hero shooter at this point? The core problem here wasn't just about historical accuracy, it was about the tone of the game. The trailer felt like it didn't understand what players wanted from a World War II Battlefield game, which felt strange after DICE delivered an absolute gem with Battlefield 1. Players expected something gritty, grounded and perhaps even emotionally resonant. What they got instead looked flashy, chaotic and kind of silly in a way. And because this was the first impression, and let's not forget, first impressions are everything, it left many people confused and frustrated. Rather than rally in excitement, the trailer kicked off a wave of controversy that would follow the game all the way to the release and even beyond. And crucially, DICE didn't do a great job of clarifying or walking back on any of the confusion. Instead of showing more grounded gameplay or explaining their design choices, they simply doubled down. That choice would come back to haunt them. After the confusing reveal trailer, the situation with Battlefield 5 quickly spiraled into something far bigger than just disappointment over gameplay tones or even the aesthetics. it turned into a flashpoint in the ongoing culture war over politics in gaming. The conversation stopped being about whether the game looked fun or accurate, and shifted to heated arguments over identity, diversity, and what players felt developers were trying to say within the game. The inclusion of the female soldier with a mechanical arm, and the customization options shown later, like blue face paint, over-the-top outfits that didn't fit the theme of World War II, and prosthetic limbs, became symbolic in many players' eyes, not just of questionable design decisions, but of a broader agenda. A large portion of the fanbase started to feel that DICE and EA were deliberately pushing modern progressive values into a historical setting in a way that felt artificial, and to some, even preachy. And there is one thing gamers hate, is being preached to. To be fair, some of the online backlash did attract trolls and other people. People who really were upset just because a woman was on the cover of a World War II game. But at the same time, many long-time Battlefield fans were expressing more nuanced concerns. Not that there were female characters at all, but that the presentation felt out of step with the franchise's legacy. They felt like the criticisms, many of which focused on tone setting and actual gameplay direction, were being unfairly lumped in with the internet toxicity. And that's where EA and DICE made one of the biggest missteps. Instead of drawing a line between constructive criticism and the toxic hate, or offering context, clarity, or examples of real-life women in the war to back up their choices, EA responded in a way that sounded defensive. In one of the most infamous moments leading up to release, Patrick Söderlund, the then Chief Creative Officer at EA, gave an interview where he said, "These are people who are uneducated. They don't understand that this is a plausible scenario. And listen, this is a game, and today gaming is gender diverse, like it hasn't been before. There are a lot of female people who want to play, and male players who want to play as a badass woman. We don't take any flack, we stand up for the cause, because I think those people who don't understand it, well, you have two choices. Either accept it, or don't buy the game. I'm fine with either or." That one sentence, especially the last 4 words, became a lightning rod for controversy. To frustrated fans who felt like their feedback was being ignored, it sounded like a middle finger. Instead of opening a dialogue, EA had drawn a line in the sand. If you're not on board with this direction, we don't care if you buy our game. And so people didn't. You also can't call your audience uneducated and insult them and then expect them to be fine with that. The phrase "don't buy the game" quickly spread across YouTube, Reddit, Twitter, and gaming news sites. It was turned into memes, mocked in reaction videos, and used by critics to justify calls for boycotts. Even people who weren't particularly upset about the trailer or the representation began to take notice. Not necessarily because of the game itself, but because of how EA was handling the conversation around it. Instead of calming the waters, EA's statements threw gasoline on the fire. Instead of saying, "We hear your concerns and here's how we're thinking about historical representation and personalisation," they essentially said, "We're right, and if you don't agree, don't bother showing up and fuck off." It's important to note that all this happened before the game even launched. The marketing campaign that had turned a significant part of the fanbase, and one that had followed Battlefield for years, into skeptics or outright people who just wouldn't buy the game. I mean, after all, you told them not to. And the more those fans voiced concerns, the more they felt the developers were treating them as part of the problem. What made all this worse was the broader cultural climate in gaming at the time. The late 2010s were filled with heated debates about representation in games, forced diversity, and whether developers were prioritising political messaging over good gameplay. Whether you agreed with one side or the other, it was clear that gaming had become another battleground in larger societal arguments. And that is still the case today and has only gotten worse. So when Battlefield 5 came out swinging with a highly stylised female soldier in the spotlight and a strong pro-inclusion message, it just didn't land. It hit like a grenade in the middle of a years-long internet war over what kind of stories games should tell and who they should be made for. This isn't to say that EA or DICE were wrong for wanting to include more representation. I'm not taking sides. In fact, if they had communicated that intention with more care and historical depth, it might have been accepted a little bit more. But because the game's marketing led with flashy imagery, rather than grounded gameplay, and because the response to criticism was so blunt and dismissive, it felt to many fans like they were being lectured, not invited to play the game. And that perception, fair or not, was hard to shake. After that moment, the Battlefield community fractured. You had players who felt betrayed and began actively rooting for the game to fail. You had defenders who dug in hard at calling anyone who criticised the game sexist or a reactionary. and you had a large number of people in the middle, players who just wanted a solid World War II shooter, who now felt completely alienated by the noise on both sides. The conversation around the game turned sour. It wasn't just about maps, guns or gameplay mechanics anymore, it was about whether you were on the right side of the argument. That kind of polarisation is toxic for any game, and it made it almost impossible to have productive conversations about the game's actual merits or flaws. By the time Battlefield 5 launched, the game was already carrying a huge amount of baggage, and much of it had nothing to do with the game's quality or content. It had become a symbol in a larger argument, and that baggage dragged it down at every turn. At the heart of the Battlefield franchise is a very specific kind of appeal. Fans don't just come for big explosions or higher player counts. They come for the series' trademark's mix of large-scale warfare, semi-realistic gameplay, and the feeling of being a small cog in a massive chaotic war. Whether you're storming a beach, piloting a Spitfire, or holding a flag under artillery fire, Battlefield has always tried to strike a careful balance between spectacle and immersion. And for the most part it worked, until Battlefield 5 came along and seemed to forget what made the franchise special in the first place. The biggest issue for a lot of long-time fans wasn't any one detail. It was a creeping sense that Battlefield didn't seem to know what kind of game it was trying to be. DICE leaned hard into cosmetic customization, allowing players to equip soldiers with outlandish gear that looked totally out of place in the context of World War II. These choices might have worked in a game that was maybe set in a different time period, where immersion maybe wasn't as much of a priority. But in a game set during one of the most brutal and historically significant conflicts in human history, it felt jarring. Customization isn't inherently bad. In fact, done well, it can enhance a game by giving players more freedom to express themselves. But in Battlefield 5, it clashed directly with the atmosphere many players wanted from a World War II game. Instead of pulling them deeper into the world, it broke the immersion. When you're charging a trench line in France and you see someone sprinting beside you looking like fucking Braveheart, it's hard to take the scene seriously. This tonal confusion didn't just irritate players, it actually turned off the series' most dedicated core. These are the players who stuck with Battlefield 3 through countless updates, who defended Battlefield 4 after its rocky launch, who were blown away by the fresh take in Battlefield 1. These are players who aren't just interested in gunplay, they care about historical context, the flow of the maps, the grounded design of weapons and vehicles, and the gritty cinematic tension that Battlefield games seem to capture really well. For this group, Battlefield 5 felt like a betrayal, not because it featured women, not because it tried something new, but because it seemed to discard the identity of the series without fully replacing it with something better. It didn't feel like a bold and new vision of Battlefield. It felt like an identity crisis wrapped in marketing buzzwords. And the thing is, many of these loyal fans tried to stay hopeful. They wanted to believe DICE had a plan. They waited for dev updates, roadmaps, and transparency about how the game would evolve. But the more they saw, the more it confirmed their worst fears. That Battlefield was becoming something they didn't recognise anymore. What made all of this worse was the inconsistency in messaging from DICE and EA. On one hand, they insisted that Battlefield 5 was aiming for historical authenticity, at least in terms of settings and themes. On the other hand, they were showcasing characters and cosmetics that just didn't fit that time period. And couple that with a gameplay that tried to be more realistic and immersive. Things like attrition, fortifications, and many other things were put into enhanced immersion into the game. Yet you had these customization options that were the complete polar opposite to it. This contradiction created a constant push-pull. You couldn't tell whether the game wanted you to take it seriously or not. And when players questioned this, they didn't get clear answers. They got vague statements about player freedom and embracing a live service future, which didn't actually address the disconnect people were feeling. If Battlefield 5 had fully embraced an alternate history angle and marketed itself that way, it might have worked, but trying to sell it as both authentic and fantastical in a way just left everyone confused. By the time the game's release rolled around, many players who had been genuinely excited had already checked out mentally. They weren't angry anymore, they were just disinterested, and that's arguably worse for a multiplayer game. Once a core player base starts to drift away, it creates a ripple effect. Servers become quieter, community discussions lose momentum, and the sense of shared excitement that keeps a game alive begins to fade. Some stuck around hoping it would improve, others bought the game, played for a few hours and quietly walked away, and plenty more just didn't buy it at all, because after all you told them not to. But for those who stuck around and wanted to play the game, a lot was riding on its post-launch content. The game arrived with relatively limited multiplayer maps and a bare-bones single-player component, relying heavily on its live service model branded as Tides of War to keep the game fresh and players engaged. This wasn't unusual. Almost every AAA game was moving toward a live service approach where content rolls out gradually instead of being front-loaded at launch. In theory, it's a smart way to keep a game relevant for years, but for Battlefield 5, the execution of this model was absolutely terrible. The Tides of War model promised a constantly evolving Battlefield, rotating challenges, new content seasons, and the idea that the game would grow richer and deeper over time. But in practice, the updates were sporadic, underwhelming, and often felt disconnected from an overreaching direction. Maps and factions were introduced at a frustratingly slow pace. The iconic US and Soviet forces, absolute staples of any World War II experience, were conspicuously absent at launch and took nearly a full year to arrive. In the meantime, players were stuck cycling through a handful of maps with mostly European theatres of war, leading to burnout and fatigue, because how many times can you play the same maps? When new maps did drop, they weren't that great. There were moments of brilliance, like the stunning Wake Island remake and the Pacific Theatre content drop later on, but by the time these arrived, the game's player base had already eroded significantly. It felt like DICE was constantly playing catch-up, delivering great content way too late, long after many players had lost interest. Another major issue was the lack of transparency and clear communication from DICE. The studio rarely explained delays, content adjustments, or design changes in a meaningful way. Promised features would get quietly delayed or scrapped without explanation, and the game's subreddit and official page became minefields of frustration filled with players demanding answers and feeling like they were yelling into a void. Worse, there were several instances where DICE would tease upcoming features or content, only to walk them back later. The live service model only works when players feel like the developers are listening and that their journey is going somewhere. With Battlefield 5, it felt more like DICE was improvising, and not in a good way. Eventually, it all caught up. By mid-2020, DICE announced that Battlefield 5 would receive no more major updates. The game's live service lifespan was effectively over, less than 2 years after launch. Compare that to Battlefield 1, which continued to receive substantial updates and expansions well past its first year, and the contrast is stark. The ending felt abrupt and unsatisfying. It was as if EA and DICE had quietly decided to move on. No grand finale, no significant content drop to close out the game's story, just silence. And for fans who stuck it out through all the delays, controversies, and uneven updates, it was a rough way to end things. From the start, DICE and EA misread their audience. The marketing for the game didn't just confuse, it also alienated players. What should have been a celebration of Battlefield's return to its roots ended up becoming a PR nightmare filled with cultural baggage and defensive messaging. Instead of focusing on building trust, they focused on making a point, and when fans responded with skepticism or criticism, that feedback was too often met with condescension or silence. Gameplay wise, Battlefield 5 wasn't even that bad. It had moments of brilliance. The gunplay was decent, some of the maps were really fun, and the Pacific expansion showed that DICE could still deliver excellent content when they were dialed in. But these flashes of potential were buried under constant inconsistencies. Poor content pacing, live service delays, and tonal whiplash made it hard for even the most committed fans to stay engaged. Perhaps most tragically, Battlefield 5 failed to capitalise on what could have been a golden opportunity. With a better launch, stronger communication, and a more confident vision, it could have brought World War II to a generation of players in a way that balanced historical respect with modern innovation. Instead, it tried to be everything at once. Serious and weird, grounded and fantastical, authentic and expressive, and the result was a fractured experience that never quite knew what it wanted to be. By the time support ended, the game was abandoned, not just by its developers, but by its own ambition. It simply faded into irrelevance, and that's what ultimately made Battlefield 5 so disappointing. It wasn't a total failure, it was a missed opportunity with the potential to be something great.